You heard me, Arthur. You just need to sign the papers and you're done. My wife Annie, to whom I was married for over 25 years, spoke to me. I tried to listen, but her voice became further and further away the longer her tirade against me continued. It all started this afternoon when I came home from work. She sat at the table with a glass of wine and a determined expression on her face. But unfortunately, she only had one glass for her, and she drank from it. Because the conversation was getting complicated, she didn't think I might like it, or, given the way the conversation was going, that I might need a drink too. I knew it was going to be bad when I sat down. She didn't ask how my day was, she just immediately let me know that she was leaving me. Annie had found her soulmate, someone who made her heart sing in a way I never could, and I was no longer good enough for her. It was difficult for me to hear her. The problem was that as her voice got louder, everything sounded quieter and quieter to me. Our story was pretty typical. Annie and I met in high school and stayed together. Our daughter Sally was born about 6 months after we got married. She wasn't the main reason we got married, but it was on the agenda. Today we both had good jobs, although we were not rich. I would say we were upper middle class. We had already paid off a house a few years ago and had a decent savings account. We often said we loved each other, took regular family vacations, and although we didn't have as much sex as when we first got married, we still had it on average a couple times a week. I thought we loved each other deeply and would say we would grow old together until today. Annie was still ranting, her face turning red as she continued to tell me what was going on. Arthur, look at me. It was becoming difficult for me to concentrate, but I turned my head towards her. You must sign these papers. She continued to point to the documents in front of me. Her voice was demanding, but it was hard for me to concentrate. It was as if the light and colors in the room had faded, although the light was on in the kitchen. Mentally, I was upset, but my body didn't react. And the longer I didn't react, the more furious Annie became. The last thing I can remember is Annie slapping me. I didn't feel the impact. I just thought it would leave a big red mark on my face. But again, I could not move, and the world continued to plunge into darkness. It was a long day. Classes at the university were postponed because there was an accident. The electricity went out, and we were sent home. I couldn't figure out what was going on when I got home. The house was terribly quiet. The lights were on, my father's car was there, but my mother's was not. When I entered the kitchen, I threw my bag and books onto a chair. Dad was sitting at the table. He didn't move. He just looked into space. On the other side of the table, there was an open bottle of my mother's wine and an almost empty glass. In front of my dad lay a stack of papers with many "Sign Here" inscriptions on them. I walked up to my dad and touched his shoulder from behind. Hi, Dad. I expected him to turn around, but he didn't react. I walked around and looked at his face, and I couldn't help but gasp. His eyes glazed over, becoming almost milky white, and it looked like tears were flowing from his eyes before, but he didn't blink. A stream of saliva came out of his mouth and began to drip onto his lap. I felt panic. Dad! Wake up, Dad! I couldn't help but cry. A minute later, Dad still didn't answer. I knew I had to calm down. I told myself, slow down, Sally. Daddy needs help. I pulled out my phone and called 911. I made it clear to them that I could not get my father, Arthur Smith, to answer. They asked me for my details and address, and I told them my name, Sally Smith, and our home address. They sent an ambulance, telling me it would arrive in about 10 minutes. For the next few minutes I sat, looked at my dad, and held his hand. I spoke to him quietly, letting him know that everything would be okay. This man gave me everything growing up. He worked a lot, but was always present at my school events, musicals, and ballet. When I was just learning to play the violin, he spent hour after hour suffering from the screeching in my ears, always encouraging me. Finally, he saved enough money to buy me a Heidersign violin for my 16th birthday. It wasn't bad, not the best, but it was better than my other practice violins. 5 years later, I was at university studying music with a focus on strings and violin. I had 2 other better violins, but this one had a special place in my heart because it was given to me by my dad. I didn't know what to do while I waited. Why was Dad like this? What's happened? and I had no idea where Mom was. It was then that I looked at the documents and the words, "Petition for divorce," caught my eye. What the fuck? I read the first page of the document in a couple of minutes and goosebumps ran down my spine. For some reason unknown to me, my mother wanted to divorce my father. It seemed very likely that Dad's condition was caused by these documents. And judging by the way Mom's wine was opened, she gave Dad the documents and left him. People are often surprised how emotions change so quickly. I believe this has never happened to them before. For me, I felt that all compassion and desire to be with my mother had died. A little later, an ambulance arrived. They put Dad on a gurney and took him to the hospital. I was driving behind after I had locked the house, so I started calling on the way. I called my grandmother, my dad's mom, his sister Rhonda, his best friend. Then she called his manager at work to tell him that Dad would be away for a while. I told them I came home to find him unresponsive and on his way to the hospital. Everyone asked me to keep them updated on his condition, and his manager told me that he would arrange emergency leave for Dad and inform their boss. I knew I was putting off the next call because I was so angry with her, but I decided I needed to call my mom. The phone rang and she picked it up after a couple of rings. "Hello, Sally, my dear. How was your day?" Wow, just wow. Of course, my mother wasn't so naive as to think that I wouldn't know what was going on. Almost an hour had passed since I entered the house and found Dad. Mom knew my schedule, and from the time it was clear to her that I was already home and found out everything. "Where are you, Mom?" "I left your father." She fell silent, not wanting to say anything. I felt her hesitation. "So, in other words, you just destroyed my father, your husband, and left him without caring about it?" "Oh no, honey. I tried to explain to your father about Paul and what was going on, but he didn't react, so I thought it best to leave and let him realize that we won't be together anymore." She tried to sound like it was easy. However, having found Dad like I did, it was more than likely that she had simply ripped his heart out and thrown it at the wall while he watched, if my guess was correct. "You abandoned him when he needed help. Are you really that heartless? Do you know what's going on now, or don't you care?" Anger began to seep into my voice. "Sweetie, don't be mad now. I know this is a little shocking, but your dad will be okay. I will only ask for what is mine and some support while Paul waits to marry me. Yes, my mother has lost touch with reality." "Wicked. You haven't seen me angry yet, Mom? And just so you know, I'm on my way to pick up my dad at the hospital right now. He's in the ambulance. And when I got home, he looked like he had a stroke." "Oh, Sally, my dear, I'm sorry to hear this, but..." "No fucking buts, Mom. Let me ask you, is this Paul? You're going to see the same Paul from your job that you kept talking about?" She hesitated. "Yes, darling. Paul was the person at my mother's work that she never shut up about." "So, I take it he's a dozen years younger than you? And how long have you been having an affair with him?" She hesitated again. 6 months. "So, for the last 6 months, you've been having sex with someone from your job behind your father's back. You lied to Dad and me, hiding your relationship with your lover. I had no idea you were a fucking slut, Mom, and apparently neither did Dad, judging by the state you just left him in. How the hell did you think any of us would be happy about this?" "Well, I suppose not at first, but as soon as we live with Paul, you will understand that we are made for each other." She just mentioned it in the plural for the second time. Did she think I would leave my dad to move in with her and her asshole boyfriend? I felt like I was seething with anger. I knew I would say something stupid if I didn't stop. "I'm going to hang up now before I tell you something that I may not be able to take back, but let me be completely clear. I will not be moving away from Daddy, and there is no way in hell I will go anywhere near Paul, let alone anywhere near his house where you are slutty with him." "Sally Smith," she shouted, "I am your mother, and you will not talk to me like that no matter how upset you are." "Then I think we're done talking." And I hung up before she could say anything else. If she thought I was going to condone what she was doing, she was crazy. She tried to call me back several times, then she started calling my dad's phone, which was stupid because even if he had it, I doubt he would have answered her call. I had my dad's phone, so I ignored all her calls. By the time I got to the hospital, The ambulance crew had admitted Dad and he was in the room under observation. Aunt Rhonda showed up and let me know that she had also received a few calls from my mother, but wasn't sure what was going on other than that her brother was in the hospital. When I explained what happened, Aunt Rhonda blushed so hard that I could almost see steam coming out of her ears. "Sally, do you have the documents that bitch left for my brother?" Of course, Aunt Rhonda here. In addition to being my aunt, Rhonda was also our family lawyer. So for the next hour, we sat next to Dad while Rhonda read the documents and took notes, occasionally swearing under her breath. Doctors and nurses periodically came in and out of the room, checking on Dad. "Well, the bad news is that your mother is going to divorce your father. The timeline outlined here shows that this has been going on for over 2 months and should have been filed this week, or it would have cost her far more than her legal team's fees." I shrugged. I had every excuse my mother could give me. Because of what she did, I no longer wanted Dad to be with her. It was strange. I was never a daddy's girl. I always looked up to my mother, but her act was simply disgusting. Paul, her soulmate, did it. No matter what, Mom and Dad shouldn't be together anymore. Rhonda continued, "The good news is that she hired a crooked lawyer to represent her. She will have to pay him a lot just for the divorce and much more if the case goes to court." She smirked. "Whereas my dear brother has the best lawyer in town, and he's going to get a 100% family discount." We smiled at each other for the first time that evening. Also, some of the claims here, where she wants 50% of the money in the house and 60% of the financial assets, plus spousal support and child support, are probably pretty ridiculous. I'm going to guess from your reaction that you don't plan to live with your mother? I shook my head. Good. I have some initial thoughts, but we need to see what happens to your father over the next 24 hours. Your mother may already be in trouble for abandoning him and could be facing charges of mental cruelty. The next few days flew by as doctors constantly checked on Dad. Physically, he was fine and healthy, but he was simply unresponsive. I studied in a hospital chair by the bed with a laptop and textbook in my hands. Every now and then, one of the family would come by to give me a break, and I would go home, sleep for a few hours, change my clothes, and come back. I admit, I cried a lot when I was alone in the house. One of the big surprises was that the owner of the company where Dad worked came to check on him. Although I knew his manager, Tom, I had never met his actual boss. Surprise! It was a woman. Tina Williams was a striking woman, sensual, slender, with tanned skin, dark raven hair, and blue eyes that I could tell sparkled, making every man alive and probably some women swoon. It turns out my dad was one of a group at his work who was there for Tina a few years ago when she went through a messy divorce. Her cheating ex-husband tried to take away her daughter and most of their savings, and almost got half of her business before Dad introduced her to Aunt Rhonda. Rhonda turned the tables, eliminating the need for Tina to give away any part of her business and ensuring that Tina received child support for their then 6-year-old daughter. Tina came several times and was stunned when I told her the general outline of what happened and why he was here in the hospital. She would bring cards from everyone at Dad's work and sit and hold his hand and tell him stories from work that happened while he was away. It turns out that my father was the life of the party in the office, and everyone couldn't get enough of his antics. I should tell you that Dad is an accountant by profession and works for one of the financial companies that help banks process payments to financial institutions. It can be a tiring job, but apparently my dad makes the workday a little brighter for everyone. One afternoon, about 2 weeks later, I had just returned from home. When I entered the room, Rhonda and Tina were finishing their conversation. I could tell it was a little heated, but their anger was directed at my mother, not each other. My mother wrote a letter to Tina demanding that she be given access to all of Dad's bonuses over the past few years. It didn't matter that the money had already been paid. The letter demanded that she receive 50% of it in a specified bank account within 30 days, or she would sue Tina. Apart from the stupidity of asking for money already paid, it looks like she and her new beau are short of cash. since I froze all their joint assets while Arthur is being treated," Rhonda said, with a very predatory grin on her face. I laughed, announcing my presence. "Yes, this morning I received my first message from my mother in 2 weeks, a text message asking me to give her money. I didn't answer because I was still very upset about her actions. I mean, she hasn't asked about Dad once since I told her what she did to him. Over the past couple of weeks, Tina has become very worried about my father's hurt feelings. Whenever my mother was mentioned, her eyes would narrow and her voice would drop an octave, indicating a deep dislike of her. It was almost as if I could see flames appearing around the edges of those burning eyes. I just hoped she would never have to sit in a room with my mother. I was afraid she might burn it down. I may not love my mother very much now, but she was still my mother. She destroyed the most wonderful person. Sally, if it weren't for your father, I wouldn't have my Clarissa or my business. Many people in the office helped me during one of the hardest moments of my life, but your father spent a lot of time listening to me. He never judged my ex-husband or me, he just let me vent. No one has ever really done this without voicing their opinion. He introduced me to your aunt, making sure I was looked after. If he was a single man, I would pursue him with everything I had after the divorce. I shrugged and let a smile light up my face. Well, soon he will be a lonely man. This brought realization to their faces. Rhonda giggled, and Tina smiled. Thank you, Sally. I needed it. I still can't believe what your mother did to him, or that she rejected such a wonderful man. I have to go to the office, but first, I'll do this. Tina walked up to my father, and, as Rhonda and I watched, leaned over and kissed him gently but sincerely on the lips. She looked at us and smiled, but her smile turned to shock a moment later when my dad groaned. When I woke up, I felt soft lips on mine, just the right amount of pressure, and behind them was a sensual and gentle intention that conveyed an affection I hadn't felt in a long time. I heard the beeping of medical equipment and myself groaning as almost every muscle in my body ached. I expected Annie to be standing over my bed when I opened my eyes after such a tender kiss, but there was Tina standing there with a smile on her face. Tina? Sally and Rhonda came up from the other side of the bed. It's okay, Daddy. Everything will be fine with you, do you hear? My memories caught up with me a moment later, and I realized that Annie was leaving me, or, more likely, had already left me. What's happened, Ed? Over the next few minutes, the three of them filled me in on how Sally had discovered that I was unresponsive and called an ambulance, how she had found divorce papers that said Annie had been cheating on me for several years, months. I found out how Annie threatened Tina once Rhonda blocked our finances until they found out what was happening to me. How long? 2 weeks, Arthur, Rhonda answered. I looked at Tina. Tina, did you kiss me? Tina blushed. Yes, sorry, I was going back to the office and saying goodbye. I smiled. No, everything is okay. I'm already in the market, so I think it's okay. Over the next few hours, I was examined by numerous doctors. Examinations, blood tests, MRI. Tina canceled her visit to the office and stayed here, as did Rhonda and Sally. Among the doctors who came to see me was a psychologist. I told him how I came home and found Annie drinking alone, and she told me she was leaving me. Then I told him, when she began to intensify the onslaught, the world began to lose color. The light and sound disappeared, and it was difficult for me to move, although I wanted to. My last memory was of Annie punching me in the face and screaming at me, but I couldn't understand her words. All the girls gasped in unison when they learned that Annie was beating me while I couldn't respond. Dad, what time do you think this happened? I'd say it was about 5:30, baby. Why do you need to know this? Because it was after 7:30 when I got home and found you, so I guess Mom must have left you there alone for quite a long time. The psychologist intervened. It's not unusual for someone in your situation to be abused while they don't respond. And in your case, I would say that you went into some shock when you heard your wife announce that she was leaving you. Of course, this is a much more extreme case than we usually see, but it makes sense. Rhonda spoke. When Arthur was little, there was a bully several years older than him. He teased Arthur quite often, and one day one of the parents in the neighborhood found Arthur lying on the ground in the park. From what our parents told me, they put him to bed, and he woke up the next morning. No one ever thought much about it, since the next day he woke up at the same time as usual. But it really happened. I nodded. I remember Billy pushing me and teasing me in the park. After a while, I don't remember what happened, but when I woke up, Mom and Dad told me that I had lost consciousness and someone had carried me home. When I told them about Billy, they went and talked to his parents. The next day, Billy came up to me at school and apologized. I chuckled at the memory. I don't think it was sincere, but after that day, he never bothered me again. Well, I think we may have some repetition here, the psychologist said. In many ways, the mind is still poorly understood. However, if something like this has happened before, it makes sense that it could happen again. I frowned. He smiled. I wouldn't worry too much. With the love and attention of these three lovely ladies, even if something happens again, I think you will be well taken care of. We talked for a few more minutes before he excused himself and left. I also felt tired. This may sound strange to someone who has been sleeping for the past 2 weeks, but I was tired, so I sent all 3 girls home to get some rest and told them they could come see me tomorrow and make sure I was okay. The next 2 days brought me back to life. Tina brought me a work laptop and gave me a few simple tasks to do just to keep me occupied. Rhonda stopped by primarily to show me the amended divorce papers and to get me to sign some documents so she could get to work dissolving my marriage to Annie. Rhonda also brought along a young detective, Karen Hill. Detective Hill questioned me for over an hour about my experiences that night with Annie. She thanked me and informed Rhonda and I that we would receive her report in a few days. I wasn't sure if we were filing a complaint against Annie. Finally, Rhonda told me to leave it all to her, kissed my forehead, and left. In the afternoon of the second day, after I woke up, I was released. As Sally said, discharged from the hospital so that I could return home. Sally accompanied me, and I was surprised when Tina met us outside the building and helped Sally walk me to her large SUV. Tina stayed for dinner that evening. We ordered takeout, she helped clean up, and then stayed with us for a couple of hours to watch TV. As she turned to leave, Sally hugged her and then made sure I walked her to her car. Tina, thank you so much for everything you have done over the past few weeks. I don't know how I can repay you, I said. Well, in a few weeks, when you feel at ease again, you can invite me to dinner and dancing. She laughed. I blushed. Just today, I left the hospital in the afternoon, and the woman whose kiss woke me up already in the evening of the same day invited me on a date. But she was pretty, and I was soon to become a bachelor again. Okay, next Friday evening after work. This will give me almost 2 weeks to get back to normal. She nodded and came over and hugged me tightly. It lingered a little longer, and I sensed more hidden meaning. As she got into her car, I found it funny that I briefly wondered what the name of this strange woman I had been married to for almost 25 years was. Over the next few days, Sally, Rhonda, and Tina fussed around me again, checking to make sure I was okay. It was nice to be so taken care of. However, the news that Rhonda brought me took us all a little by surprise that Friday afternoon. So Annie was arrested this afternoon, she said. What's happened? I asked. Well, after your statement to the police at the hospital, a warrant was issued for Annie's arrest, based on mental cruelty towards a person with disabilities. This is based on the fact that, at the time, you were immobilized and unable to defend yourself. Add to that the fact that she left you without supervision or help for an unknown amount of time, and she's in big trouble. What does this mean for divorce? Asked Tina, who joined us again for dinner. Her 8-year-old daughter Clarice was with her that evening. Clarice was watching a Disney movie in the living room while we talked. I was returning to work on Monday, so Tina would meet me there, but I was beginning to realize that she needed more than just efficient number crunching in the office. I found myself imagining what was hidden under those beautiful tight clothes she wore every time she came to visit. Rhonda smiled. This will probably mean that some things will go in Arthur's favor. Judging by the state of the bank accounts and the house, I insist on a 50-50 split. I know we could have done more after everything that happened. However, I assume Arthur will want to be fair? I nodded. Annie won't be able to touch any of the bonus money she tried to get from you. Tina, I filed a case against her for extortion in addition to charges of mental cruelty. This won't do much except stop her touching things that don't belong to her. Most likely, she will come out in a couple of days, not the least bit worse for wear, and will be able to return to her pig soulmate. What I want to do is settle the divorce quickly using Arthur's visit to the hospital. Then I have plans depending on how she reacts. I will make sure that nothing unnecessary is taken from Arthur, she smiled. So, how long will the divorce take, Aunt Rhonda? Asked Sally. I believe everything is going well. It should take about 3 months. If Annie wants to fight something, I'll bring in the big guns, and it will take longer, but it will hurt her a lot more. That evening, as I walked Tina to the car, Sally helped Clarissa into the back seat. Tina hugged me again and surprised me with a short kiss, reminding me of how I woke up the other day. Arthur, I know that you are married and you are an honest person, so I am not going to rush too much. But I want to claim you now and let you know that I want you. Of course, I've wanted you for a long time, but I would never pursue a married man or break someone's marriage vows. It happened to me, and I don't want it to happen to anyone else, even if their marriage is falling apart. I looked into her deep blue eyes for a moment and brushed a strand of her dark raven hair out of her face before I leaned in to kiss her. But instead of a soft and gentle kiss, I let the kiss be passionate for maybe 30 seconds. I knew we both felt connected. Tina's eyes were closed when I pulled away, and her tongue ran over my lips, enjoying our kiss. I grinned. This is so that you know that I confirm your rights. We turned to look at the girls. Both of them were giggling as they watched us kiss. Clarissa was clapping her hands, and Sally had a big, shitty grin on her face. As Tina and Clarissa pulled out of the driveway, Sally hugged me and we waved. The next few months were something of a roller coaster. On the one hand, Annie wanted the divorce to go quickly. On the other hand, she was not happy with this agreement. It looks like Paul was in the driver's seat and telling her that she should get the lion's share of the assets. He fed her crap, and on some level she had to know it after all these years of marriage. As the settlement demands became increasingly outlandish, Rhonda made one call to Annie's lawyer and, although I don't know what was said, all objections to the settlement ceased overnight. Tina and I met every Friday night while Sally began babysitting Clarice, picking her up from school and keeping an eye on her, giving Tina and I time to have dinner, drink coffee, watch a show, or go dancing. Of course, we never did anything more than hold hands and kiss, but I had a feeling that the evening of my divorce would be something different. I went back to work and everything was going well for us. As a financial institution, we made a good profit, but we weren't in the big leagues. We all did our jobs, we were paid well for it, and we generally had a good time together as a group. I think the staff realized that at some point Tina and I were becoming a couple. Although everyone was happy for both of us, I had to tone down my usual antics. My line manager, who reported to Tina, made sure no one talked about our behavior in the workplace, since I was practically meeting with his boss. About 3.5 months later, we received notice that the divorce would be finalized in a week, starting the following Thursday. There was no trial, but Annie asked for a meeting to talk before the final ruling. I agreed the day before, and we agreed that she would come to the house to see Sally and me. I took the afternoon off and cooked lamb chops and dumplings and gravy for the 3 of us. It was a favorite dish for all 3 of us, and I hoped it would make the evening conversations a little less awkward. Sally got home around 5:30 and went to shower and change. Then just before 6, the doorbell rang, and Annie was standing at the front door. Now, I haven't described Annie all this time, but maybe I will now. Before everything fell apart a few months ago, Annie was an attractive housewife in her 40s. She had short, shoulder-length brown hair, a curvy mom figure, and although she weighed a few pounds more than she liked, she was still very attractive. With a great bust and an ass to match, she was a great-looking woman. But unfortunately, the woman standing in front of me was almost unrecognizable. Annie had put on a lot of weight. She had jowls and big plump cheeks. Her belly, which had always been a little bulging, now hung over her pants, and that curvy mommy ass that I loved was swollen beyond recognition. Moreover, she was wearing baggy clothes that hid her thickness. I'm not against fat women, but this wasn't Annie. I think my shock at her body showed on my face. Annie winced but didn't say anything. Hi Annie, please come in. We walked into the kitchen, and I offered her a glass of wine, which she accepted. We chatted about trifles for a few minutes. She asked about work and if I was taking care of myself. I asked her about work and didn't bother commenting on how she should take care of herself. That's what Paul wants. He didn't like how skinny I was, so we worked on getting me to gain weight. She mentioned the unspoken question. I frowned. For more than 25 years, I loved this woman. And yet, despite what she did to me, I still worried about her health. You don't approve, do you? She looked at me. No, Annie, I don't know. When we were together, you were in excellent slim condition and healthy. But to be honest, I'm shocked by your appearance. You don't look well. And if I weren't so hurt by what you did, I would be very worried about your health and would try to help you. But you don't care, do you? Her face dropped. You and Sally, you're happy and healthy without me here. Well, there's a part of me that cares, but when you left here and pretty much left me to die, I shrugged. She sighed. I deserve it. I did a terrible thing, didn't I? No, Mom. Sally had just emerged from the shower. You did a damn terrible thing. You single-handedly tore a happy family apart and then walked out the door without a care in the world, and I, for one, can't understand why Dad agreed to let you come here tonight. Sally, calm down. Your mother knows what situation we are in and how unhappy we all are. Coming here must have been difficult for her. She asked for this meeting tonight, so I thought the least we could do is be adults and listen to her. Sally was not happy. As far as I understood, she, like me, had not spoken to her mother since that fateful day. Judging by the way my daughter looked at her mother, this wasn't going to end well for anyone. It was time to change the subject. I tried to appear happy. Difficult conversations are not good on an empty stomach, so let's eat first. So I served dinner. No one said a word, but there were a lot of glances at each other around the table. Sally just stared at her mother the whole time. After dinner, I cleared the table, and Annie asked to speak to Sally alone first. No way in hell can you tell me whatever you want in front of both of us. I was surprised, but I could see that Sally was determined not to be alone with her mother. I think Annie saw it too. The look in her eyes was exactly the same as her mother when she did this to me that fateful night. She nodded. Annie took a deep breath. She didn't want to do this in front of me, but she looked at Sally. Well, Sally, I wanted to ask you to forgive me for what I did that night. I thought this through all wrong, and no matter what, I don't want to be away from my daughter forever. Annie looked at me. There is one more thing, but I would prefer to say it in private and not in front of your father. Sorry, Mom, but if you can't say it to both of us, then I don't want to hear it. With that, before Annie could do anything else, Sally stood up and left. A moment later, we heard her bedroom door slam. I wanted everything to go better, Annie said quietly, more for herself than for me. I think it went pretty well, all things considered, I told her, letting her know I heard her. Really? Yes, indeed, I sighed. Annie, you have to understand that right now, everyone who lives in this house doesn't like you very much. She started to answer, and I raised my hand. Let me finish and lay it out for you. First, you had a long-term sexual relationship with some asshole, then you hid it from both Sally and me. Then, out of the blue, you hand me the divorce papers, and after I've taken the hit and am speechless, you scream and then slap me. Annie looked like a deer caught in headlights. Yes, I still have memories of most of that confrontation until you hit me the first time. Now let's continue. Then you leave me at some point when I don't react and leave me there until Sally comes home and finds me in a state of insanity. Annie looked scared now. When Sally calls you, you show absolutely no concern for me when your daughter is clearly worried about her father. You never once inquired about my health until tonight. You made unreasonable demands on my employer. And when you walk in here, it's still all about you. You ask Sally to forgive you, but you never said you were sorry to her. I paused just for a moment to see if it would get through to her. Yes, Annie. I think with all that said, it went really well. Annie was now looking at the floor with tears in her eyes. They hadn't hit the floor yet, but they were getting ready. I didn't know if they were for Sally, for me, or just still about herself. I continued. So, our divorce will be final tomorrow? And if you have nothing else to say, then I think we have fulfilled your request for a final meeting. I walked to the door and opened it. Annie looked at me and left. Having crossed the threshold, she turned and looked at me. Arthur, we've really had a few good years, haven't we? Yes, Annie. Most of our time together was amazing. You were a wonderful lover, a caring wife, and a loving mother. I don't know what that idiot Paul did to you, but I don't see anything of the woman I fell in love with in the man standing in front of me. All I see is a lost being who was manipulated by someone into gaining wheat, like a fucking pig, and becoming selfish and not caring about the people around her. She looked at her feet again. You really mean it, don't you, Arthur? Yes. She turned to leave, then turned around one last time. This time she looked broken. Arthur, about the house and money, Paul told me that I should ask. So that was the point of this visit. It wasn't about reuniting with her family. It was just about money. I laughed bitterly. Annie looked at me, wondering why I was laughing. Go and tell your significant other that at this time tomorrow you will receive your share of the savings and equity that was in this house in the bank account that your lawyer gave to Rhonda. And Annie? She looked at me. I'm warning you. Keep this money away from Paul, otherwise you won't have it for long. The next morning brought the final decree. Annie and I were no longer husband and wife. There was a small part of me that was sad, but that was a very small part. Mostly I was happy. The last few months have not been easy for anyone. Now I was free, and at 48 years old, I still had a lot of life in me. Rhonda called me and said that she would have pizza at my house tonight. Sally popped into the office for lunch. We talked about her mother and happier times when we were a family. I know she didn't love her mother very much, but I know she missed the woman she used to be. To be honest, me too. We had many good years together. Well, I think there was a signal between Sally and Tina when Sally left, because not even 5 minutes later I was called into Tina's office, and she slammed the door and then kissed me like the sun would never rise again, although I have to admit that I may have kissed her back in the same way. Can I declare that you are mine now, Arthur? I felt a sore spot on my neck where there may or may not have been a hickey when she kissed my neck a minute ago. I think you may have already done this. Dinner that night was great. Sally, Rhonda, Tina, and Clarissa were with me, and we celebrated my freedom from Annie. That Friday night, while the girls were in bed, Tina and I consummated our platonic relationship. I must have done something right, because for the rest of the weekend, every time she sat down, she squeaked slightly, as if she was in a little pain, but her smoldering eyes burned with a fire that I knew was only for me. 6 months later, we got married in a beautiful small ceremony at a local lake with many people from work in attendance. We'd like to get married later. However, we wanted to make it before Sally and Clarissa's little brother was born. It was 5 years later, Sally, her boyfriend Tina, and I had just sat down to dinner at one of our local restaurants when 5-year-old Keegan asked, "Dad, who is this lady who keeps staring at us?" We all turned around and saw Annie sitting across from us. She lost a lot of weight. She stared at us and didn't look pleased with herself. We haven't seen or heard from her since we got divorced. She never even tried to contact Sally. I apologized to the family and approached them. "Hello, Annie. Hello, Arthur. How are you doing?" She looked down at the chicken salad she was eating. "You were right, Arthur. You were right about him. Paul convinced me that I was his soulmate and you were nothing. But when I didn't get the money up front, he convinced me to gain weight because he loved me and loved fat women. When I got the money after the divorce, you told me not to give it to him, but I didn't listen. He spent it in a couple of months and then he left me and disappeared without ever marrying me. I was still upset with her, but her story didn't have a happy ending like mine did. From then on, I spent every moment trying to rebuild the confidence he destroyed and get back to who I used to be." She fought back tears and looked at me. After all these years, that look of hers was the look of the Annie I used to know. "Arthur, I'm so sorry. I treated you like dirt. I did it because I was convinced that Paul knew everything you didn't know. I left the only man who had ever truly loved me and—" She stopped and grabbed the edge of the table. "You could have died because of what I did. I know you can never forgive me, but I want to say that I'm very sorry." Now she was crying openly. Surprisingly, Sally came and stood next to me. She also heard her mother's apology. I looked at her, and she smiled tiredly at me and grabbed my hand. I don't know, maybe this was the first time she saw that her mother was truly sorry. Her gaze softened, and she extended her hand to her mother. Seeing Sally standing there and then extending her hand, Annie panicked and tried to get up and walk away, but Sally blocked her path. "Mom, stop it! You don't have to go anywhere!" Sally slid into the booth next to Annie and I sat on the other side. I looked at Tina and saw her nod. So for the next hour, mother and daughter talked. There were a lot of reconciliations, there were quite a lot of tears, but for once, they were useful and not harmful. Once they had finished talking, Sally and I brought Annie to the table and introduced her to everyone else. I could tell Annie was pretty upset when she was introduced to Keegan as Aunt Annie. After that day, we kind of let Annie back into our lives. Sally slowly reconnected with her mother. Every week or two, they drank coffee. The trust between them grew slowly, but it grew nonetheless. When Sally got married, Annie actually took on the role of mother of the bride. Tina would invite Annie over to our house for dinner from time to time, and at first I think it was out of spite for Annie for everything she had given up, and Tina benefited by marrying me. However, although they were never close, Tina and Annie had a strange friendship that I never understood. Rhonda never forgave Annie for what she did to me, although she was always polite to her whenever they came into contact. And well, with Tina's blessing, Annie and I did a little post-marital counseling. We discussed many of our problems since that time, more than 5 years ago. The consultant thought Annie might have hormonal problems. However, Annie did not admit this. "No, that day I threw away the most important thing for me. I had a husband who loved me and a daughter who wanted to be with me. No amount of hormonal imbalance can justify the way I systematically ruined everything good in my life for some asshole who whispered sweet nothings in my ear, who was a piece of shit in the bedroom and who had a manhood so small from the waist down that you can't even notice that it is inside." She smiled sweetly at me with this statement. Arthur and Sally deserved much better from me. She cried and then wiped her tears with a napkin. 5 years passed before I was able to reconnect, 5 years that I lost and was not with them. I thank God every day that Arthur allowed me back into his life. And Tina, too. She blushed at this confession. She had every right to hate me, but she treated me warmly every time we met. No, she was lucky. She got everything I threw away, and I will pay for it for the rest of my life. Annie benefited from these sessions much more than I did. It was helpful to confirm that neither Sally nor I had done anything to cause Annie to leave us. And she was right. Tina picked us up and made us a much stronger family. As they say, people pay for their mistakes if they make them long enough, which is what Paul did. He moved to another state and again tried to steal a married woman and her money. But this time, the husband caught Paul with his wife and turned him into a eunuch. The husband received 10 years, but it looks like he will soon be released if rumors from Rhonda, who now represented him, are true. Tina and I love each other very much. I never thought I would ever be able to love as much and as deeply as I loved Annie. But Tina proved that this is not so. Tina not only gave me her love, but also gave me her whole soul without a trace. We still work at her company, and I still have the same job. We have our ups and downs, but we never let anything get in the way of communication when it's important. Her body is still outstanding, and we make love often. We even made love in some exotic places during our vacation. Usually, one look is enough, and I lock the bedroom door and make love to her. One day, we had just finished making love, showered and dressed, and when we arrived in the kitchen, we found Sally and Annie talking. Last month, we found out that Sally was expecting a baby, so there was a buzz in the room as the girls planned for my first grandchild. "Oh my God, Sally, the way they act, you'd think these two were teenagers." "Tina, you need to tell me what you're feeding Arthur. Maybe I can get some of this to feed Fred." All the girls laughed and I blushed. Annie had been dating a little lately, but nothing serious until Fred came along. "Mom, leave them alone. We all know that from then on, Dad was a man on a mission." "Since when, honey?" Annie asked. "You know," her eyes sparkled with slight mischief, "I think Dad's libido has gone up 3 notches since he woke up after being discharged from the hospital and his previous life." Annie fell silent and fell silent. Sally laughed and Tina blushed. For me, I just sat back, grinned at my girls, and felt myself getting horny again looking at Tina. Then I stood up and walked back to the bedroom. Tina followed me a moment later, locking the bedroom door behind her. Well, yes, I checked out for sure. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.